Okay, here's an interesting picture of your tongue. Kind of gross there. Your tongue is a area of skin. It's also a big, strong muscle that has certain kinds of surface on it because it's an area of skin that's going to be, masticating. It's going to be pushing up against food and stuff. All kinds of things gets rubbed up against your tongue. And the cells of your tongue are often replaced. They're often sloughed off, they're damaged, they're replaced a lot. Now you have taste buds just on certain parts of the papillae of your tongue. So the papillae of your tongue are protrusions on your tongue, sort of textures. And there are 4 types of textures on your tongue. The first type is the filiform. And the filiform texture is pretty much the entire surface of your tongue. It's present even if there's other papillae there. However, there are no taste buds in the filiform sections of the filiform papillae. Now this is probably because the filiform cover the interior surface of your tongue, and while you're chewing food and masticating food, it would be nice to have taste buds there, but unfortunately if they were there, they'd be traumatized too much. And so you don't have taste buds where you have the filiform papillae. Then there's the fungiform papillae, which are on the tip and sides of your tongue. There's the foliate, which are on the sides of your tongue. You can see they look like folia there, I guess folia means leaf maybe. The foliate are on the sides of your tongue, prominently in the back there. And then the circumvallate are in the back. So they're circumvallate because they have a circular sort of prominence there. Now the latter 3 types do have taste buds. And a taste bud is going to be an impression in a papillae that contains receptors for you to detect the chemicals that are coming into your mouth. And these chemicals stimulate the receptors in a similar way that the smell receptors are stimulated, except that here you're dealing with, directly the saliva and mucus of your tongue being the medium for the chemicals. Of course, the big difference between smell and taste in this respect is that you more or less choose what goes in your mouth. You don't choose what goes in your nose. Whatever ambient chemicals are in the air, will find their way into your nose sinuses. But presumably you select what's going to be on the surface of your tongue. So this gives you a certain expectation for what something should taste like, for what your perception ought to be. And smell is something that you can be surprised by. Here's the structure of a taste bud. Now all the papillae, except for the filiform, contain taste buds. Now a taste bud is this structure here, it's not the individual receptor. A taste bud is referring to this whole onion-shaped structure with the pore at the top, taste cells clustered there in the middle, and neurons that connect to the taste cells. Now an individual taste cell looks like the one you see on the right there, where you've got a receptor at the top, a recepting surface at the top, and you have a cell body with a nucleus and everything, and then you have a neuron that's connected to the taste cell. It's stimulated when the taste cell is stimulated. So when that taste cell encounters chemicals that it responds to, it ends up depolarizing the neuron that it's attached to. Your brain then is going to interpret that as, okay, we've got this substance, therefore, in our mouths, and that will contribute to the perception of the taste of whatever's there. Now there's about 10,000 taste buds. There's far fewer taste buds and taste cells than there are receptors in the nasal passages of the smell system. And taste actually is not as discriminating as smell for that reason. We can discriminate far fewer types of chemicals using taste cells than we can using the receptors of the nose. Now, since smell contributes to taste, so when you put something in your mouth, you're obviously going to have molecules from it that go up into your nose. And what you smell of the object is going to contribute to the perception of its taste, of its flavor. So the discrimination of the smell system will contribute to the discrimination of the eventual flavor. But the taste buds, the taste system itself, is kind of limited in the number of chemicals or chemical types it can detect. And I'll get into that in more detail in the next slide. As you may know, we have 4 different types of taste sensation. Now this is in contrast to the multitude of different kinds of smell perception. Think of all the different things that can be smelled. All of our taste flavors are going to be derived from a composite of these 4 basic types of receptor. So we have a bitterness receptor, we have a sweetness receptor, we have a sourness receptor, and we have a salt receptor. Now, these are channels in the cell membranes of the receptors, just like you've seen with other receptor systems. It's just they're going to be depolarized, or the ions themselves may actually transfer through the gates to produce stimulation of the receptor and eventual stimulation of the neuron. Now, the two on the end are the easiest to think about, easiest to conceptualize. Salt is obviously salt itself is composed of pretty primitive ions. A basic salt, of course, is sodium chloride, and here you see a sodium ion. Well, sodium flowing into the cells is a very common thing. It's part of the usual transmission of nerve impulses in receptors and neurons. So to have a sodium channels are everywhere, and so the sodium channel, it flowing through your receptor and your brain interpreting that as saltiness, is a very easy receptor to have. It was probably one of the earliest that we ever had, any organisms ever had, because sodium channels are so prevalent in the nervous system. Well, the next one over is a hydrogen ion channel. Now, hydrogen ions, of course, are very common. Hydrogen ions, if you have a number of them, you're in the presence of an acidic substance. So a lot of hydrogen ions means acid. Well, when you bite into an orange or a lemon, you're biting into a fluid that's going to have a lot of free hydrogen ions in it because it's so acidic. And that's why those things taste sour. What you're tasting is the acid. Sweetness is a receptor that's going to be stimulated mostly by hydrocarbons that are associated with, carbohydrates and sugars. Now, we know from artificial sweeteners that these receptors can also be stimulated by other compounds that are similar. So, NutraSweet is a substance, for example, that stimulates this receptor, and we perceive that substance as sweet. Now, NutraSweet is a composite of 3 amino acids making up an artificial protein that never existed before. So an experimenter in a laboratory combined them one day. He was looking for new substances to provide nutritional supplements for people so they could produce a protein, that would be a nutritional supplement for people in hospitals or people who were starving. Whenever there was a need for a stable artificial nutritional substance, he was trying to find it for his company. And he discovered by accident that this substance he had created tastes sweet. But he just set it aside. He didn't think much of it. It wasn't a very stable substance. It wasn't something they could use. And they weren't looking for an artificial sweetener, so it didn't occur to him to develop it any further. Then later, when the company was looking for an artificial sweetener, he remembered that this substance he had created before out of these 3 amino acids tasted sweet. And so he remembered that, went back to it, and created more of it, and that became NutraSweet. Now, NutraSweet, or also it's called aspartame, became such a big seller for the drug company that developed it that they launched another company just to handle it. And the person who mediated all that, who developed NutraSweet and developed the company, was Donald Rumsfeld, who later became the Secretary of Defense and was so important in the invasion of Iraq. But before he went into government, he ran a company called Searle, and Searle was the drug company that invented and developed NutraSweet. Okay, the final one is bitterness. Now, bitterness is not something that's hard. It's something that's hard to convey in words. It's hard to tell you what bitterness tastes like. And we don't usually have many substances that are purely bitter. I think if you think of the flavors associated with coffee, that coffee has a bitterness. The flavor the substance that's most commonly presented as an example of bitterness is quinine. And quinine is the flavor that's in tonic water. So if you've ever had a gin and tonic, if you just drink the tonic water, you'll perceive more or less pure bitterness. Now, quinine, the reason we have gin and tonics is because quinine is a very effective agent, a very effective treatment against malaria. And quinine apparently kills the microorganism that's in your body when you have malaria. So in the tropics and other parts of the British Empire, the British began to drink quinine with their gin. And this became gin and tonic. Tonic is a reference to a medicine. So they would take their gin and their tonic together to fight off malaria, and quinine became the basis for the tonic part. And now it's just a flavor combination. People commonly get in bars these days or restaurants. You order gin and tonic, not thinking about its history. But at any rate, tonic the quinine that's in tonic is the essence of bitterness. If you want to experience that, just go to the grocery store and buy some tonic water and drink it, and you'll definitely perceive bitterness. It is a very bitter thing. The presence, however, of gin, which tends to be kind of sweet, and the lime in a gin and tonic fights that off, and it produces a very appealing flavor in the end. If you just take tonic water with lime, it actually is a very nice drink if you don't want to consume the gin. At any rate, we have these four basic types. All the flavors that you experience are a composite of these four basic types. Now remember before, when you smell things, the smell that you experience, the aroma that you experience, is going to be the composite, could be of 100 different receptor types responding. Here you just have 4, and that produces all the flavors that we have. Okay, here's a schematic showing you the basic layout of the anatomy of pathways that come in from your tongue up into your brain. And you can see here you've got 3 cranial nerves that participate in taste. And that's because your tongue is quite close to your brain, so the nerves that come in are going to be distributed across a wider range. You won't have a single nerve coming in from your tongue. But it amounts to the same thing. It doesn't really make any difference. It's just the way the spatial arrangement is there. Well, these come in and they have their first synapse in the solitary nucleus, the solitary tract, and this is a rather long tract of nuclei in which these and other cranial nerves come into. Then neurons from the solitary tract go up into the thalamus. And this is very similar to other sensory systems. Remember, vision and hearing and so on, they all come into the thalamus first, and then they go to the cortex. So taste is from a developmental, from an evolutionary perspective, is more sophisticated than smell is. Smell goes directly into the nervous system without going to the thalamus. Now, this is probably because taste evolved from skin receptors. Your tongue, your taste buds are embedded in skin, whereas your smell receptors developed from something different. And they developed much earlier probably than your taste receptors did. Or even if they developed concurrently, the nature of skin receptors was enabled them to follow the usual sophisticated pathways associated with high-level cortical type sensory perception. Rather than going right into the limbic system like smell does, taste actually goes into a cortical system. Now, the cortical system it goes into is still relatively primitive compared to vision and hearing. It goes into an area referred to as the insula. Now, the insula is tucked in there between the temporal and the parietal frontal lobes there. And the insula, a lot of its properties, a lot of its function is not known. Clearly it's related to gustatory sensations, sensations you have in your stomach and your intestines, when you consume food and things like that. Some of these sensations are very nondescript. They're perceptually very diffuse and strange. I hesitate to use the word strange. It only is strange if you have brain damage there and you produce artificial sensations. The sensations are not something that are very easy to describe, and the person perceives them as quite odd. For example, patients that have migraines that affect that area sometimes describe, when they have the migraine, this very warm feeling that comes up from their body, from their stomach and their chest, comes up from their body and goes up over their head. And so, which is a very strange thing for a patient to describe. But that indicates that the migraine is involving the insula and gustatory sensations. It's probably related to the emotional feelings we have when we consume, food, that the limbic system is still very involved. Obviously, when you eat something, when you consume nutrition, you're satisfying a very basic drive state that, we have had, in an evolutionary sense for a long time, and it's so associated with more primitive kinds of sensations and motivations. So satiety, is associated with pleasure, and these pleasure sensations, these gustatory sensations, are very diffuse. Well, part of the pathways for taste come into the mouth area of the somatosensory cortex, the part of the cortex that mediates the face. A lot of these come right into the insula because taste is related to gustatory sensations. It's related to eating. And so when you taste something that's sugary or you taste something that's bitter, you're going to have some pretty basic emotional responses to it. And you should, because if you eat something that's bitter and it makes you throw up, it makes, it's toxic. You need to remember that, and you need to perceive it that way. And it's got to be perceived that way in a very consistent fashion. Or the next time you eat those, berries that make you feel sick or could kill you, you'll avoid them and avoid the consequences. Okay, to summarize the 4 types, again, you have salty, sour, bitter, and sweet. And all of our flavors are a combination of these basic 4. So whatever you think you're tasting, it's going to be a combination of these 4 basic flavor types. And to be interesting, people would do more research in this area, because imagine if you created something that was equally salty, equally sour, equally bitter, and equally sweet. What would that taste like? What if you increased the saltiness and the bitter and reduced the sour and the sweet? What would that taste like? And probably we would get to an idea, of how certain substances that we consume are stimulating these receptors in various sort of profiles or patterns. I've yet to see any kind of research like that being done, but it would be very interesting to explore that. Obviously, we have combinations. So potassium chloride, which is potassium chloride is, I believe that's Epsom salt. I've never tasted Epsom salt myself. That's something we used to use in the garden to make peppers grow, but because they need potassium. But potassium chloride, I believe, is Epsom salt. It has salty and bitter components. I wonder if you can taste it. It's used so often. People, they take Epsom salt baths and things. It can't be. I don't think it's harmful to you. We'll have to try that sometime and see how bitter it might taste, and contrast that with tonic water, which is sort of purely bitter. At any rate, all the things that we eat, all the things that we come in and taste, are going to be tasted. The perception that's going to be formed is going to be built out of these 4 basic types. In a similar way, colors are built out of 3 types. You're now going to have all your flavors built out of 4 types. One thing that has been discovered is that we have some genetic differences in the responsivity of different taste buds, different taste cells to different substances. And here's one area that's been covered pretty extensively. This substance, PTC, it's a substance that approximately 30% of us can't taste at all. And people who do taste it also taste bitterness and caffeine and saccharin. Saccharin is another sugar substitute. If you taste saccharin, now unfortunately I don't believe there's anything that still contains saccharin. Saccharin used to be used pretty broadly. Now NutraSweet has kind of replaced everything. You might be able to find saccharin in certain soft drinks, though, that didn't, adopt NutraSweet. At any rate, if you taste bitterness to saccharin, then you can taste PTC. And that's because you have a difference in your taste cells that's genetically determined that allows you to taste it. There are other kinds other substances that have the same sort of genetic patterns. So your receptors, even though they're still in the bitterness category, are going to taste bitterness slightly differently than others will. And it's obvious that the genetic diversity in taste cells gives us some diversity in the different kind of taste that we have. As far as I know, however, things that are salty and sweet and things that are basically acidic or sour don't have this. We all have those pretty much in common, especially the sour and the salty ones. It's these more complex protein-based, receptor sites with ion channels that have genetic differences that make bitterness a different sort of experience or perception for some people than it is for others. This is a nice graphic that shows you the relationship between smell and taste. And what you have here is a graphic depicting how well you perceive something with either your nostrils involved, smell involved, or not. Let's look at coffee here. So if you smell coffee and you're going to recognize what the smell is, the solid represents when you taste coffee with your nostrils open, so that the smell of coffee either gets in there or not. If it's closed, then you have the lower graph there, which is barely even perceptible. So if you can't smell coffee, it's very hard to recognize. And if you look at wine, vinegar, cherry smell, see, cherry flavor is very hard to discriminate without smell involved. Lemon is hard. Water is perceptible by both, equally it seems. Cinnamon, you can see big differences in these perceptions, these ability to recognize the substance, if smell is involved or not. Now, this is obviously because smell is a very, compared to taste, smell is a very sensitive system. So if you can get some of those molecules up into your nasal cavity, your olfactory mucosa will detect them. You've got all these different kinds of receptors for these things, and you'll be able to recognize these things much better if you can smell them along with tasting them. If the smell is taken away, then you're reduced to those 4 receptor types that are in the taste buds. And if you have something like lemon, lemon is very acidic, and you can see where lemon, even though smell helps you recognize lemon, you can still recognize it pretty well without smell involved. The same is true of vinegar. Vinegar is something that's very acidic. And so here you see it again, where anything that's acidic, anything that relies on a basic taste receptor can be identified by taste better without smell involved than things that are more complex, like coffee and onions, apricots, pineapple. I notice they don't have anything in here that's sort of just sugar. If they would, I wonder what that would look like. Or tonic water, from the tonic, the bitterness of quinine. Presumably those which are identified with taste receptors. So if you're tasting something that's very bitter, you should be able to perceive it, what it is, by smell and or taste. But something that requires more complex discriminations, like coffee and pineapples and cinnamon, those require both systems to be involved for you to recognize the substance accurately. But clearly smell and taste work together. That makes sense because they're in such close proximity. They both involve the detection of chemicals from the environment, and they're both related to, satisfying food, hunger, and thirst drives. You want to be able to have both of them working together to help you discriminate what's good to eat and what's not good to eat, discriminating what might be toxic to consume versus what's not toxic. You would want to have smells involved as much as you could because taste has its limitations and smell has much more discrimination. Now, animals like your pet dog, he can do this much better than we can. He's got so many more receptors in his nasal passages that he can detect very small differences in the, whether something he's able to eat it or not, things like that. You may recall, if you saw the movie Ratatouille, how the rat was so good as a chef because he could smell the differences between ripe fruit and fruit that had gone by, or things that were good quality and things that were low quality. And the human that he was working with, who he was helping, couldn't make these discriminations, and so the rat was much better at figuring out what food to combine because his smell system was so much better than the humans. I thought that was a nice touch in the movie. I'm not sure they did it for the benefit of a sensation perception class, but it clearly highlights how the lower mammals, and lower is literal as well as figurative. They are lower in an evolutionary sense, but they're also lower to the ground, and that's where all the great smells are. And so they're able to discriminate them much better than we can. This is a nice summary in schematic form of how different sensory systems contribute to the processing of what we refer to as flavor. It's referred to as flavor because it's combining smell, taste, vision, everything. And you have to think about it. When you eat something, you don't just taste it with the 4 taste buds receptors, and that's it. You feel the food in your mouth. Your tongue has receptors in it, obviously, for touch that are very sensitive. You feel its flavor. Its texture is a part of the flavor. What it looks like is part of the flavor. And if you ever see, purple ketchup, which I believe one of the companies was selling for a while, when when the Shrek movie came out, they were actually selling green ketchup. And when you see that, you realize the role of vision and taste. It's very hard to anticipate tasting the regular old tomato, ketchup flavor when it's sitting in front of you green. Well, at any rate, vision contributes to the flavor of something. When you see something, you identify what it is, and you have memories about it that use the what pathway in the temporal lobe, and so you have associations to the substance you're eating. Like I just said, I mean, I always remember ketchup to be red, and so when I see green ketchup, it creates some kind of conflict, and I have no idea what it's going to taste like. The next thing, of course, you have taste. You have the four taste receptors in your mouth, and that goes to the primary taste cortex in the insula. Then you have smell. So smell contributes a lot to the perception of a flavor, and that uses the primary olfactory cortex in the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes that goes up into the limbic system. And then you have the texture of what you're eating, and that's very important in the overall flavor. I mean, there's nothing like eating potato chips. You know, potato chips didn't crunch and crackle, or if your cereal in the morning didn't crunch and crackle. Imagine if you ate cereal and it had the texture of, say, eggs. That might really set you off. I mean, that's something where you're expecting your cereal to be of a certain texture, and when it's not, your sense of its flavor is probably, in that situation, going to be negative. You'll see it as, it's not right. There's something wrong with it. Doesn't have the right texture. It's not crunchy and fresh sounding like it usually is. It seems kind of squishy and it just doesn't seem palpable. Yet if I told you that what you were eating were eggs, you would think nothing of it. Well, eggs should feel like that, and so my flavor is going to be perceived as kind of positive. So all these things factor into the thing that we refer to as flavor, and certainly great chefs know this. They know that the texture of food is important, the visual appeal of food is important. It has to look fresh or look appealing. It has to at least look consistent with what you say it is. So if you're serving if you're serving peanut butter and it looks like mayonnaise, you're going to have trouble with people consuming it because they don't expect that kind of visual association to the object. It has to taste a certain way, and certainly chefs work on that to a great extent, trying to get the tastes and flavors to correspond to something they've invented. And smell is important. So, you hear when great wine tasters taste a wine, first thing they do is they smell it for its bouquet. The bouquet that you smell of wine is different than its taste that goes across your tongue. And great wine tasters know that the olfactory system, the smell system, is just as important as the taste system in your tongue in appreciating the fullness and the wonderful flavors of things like wine. And, of course, touch is crucial. Touch contributes to the texture. All these things together produce the thing that we call flavor. And flavor, again, like every other perception, flavor is something your brain creates from all these things working together to produce something you expect or don't expect, or something you taste that's disgusting, or something that you taste that's pleasant. All these things work together into a brain's construction of what it is that you're consuming, what it is that you're tasting.